An Irish Airman Foresees His Death by W.B. Yeats. So, first things first, and that is that before we start the presentation, I need to figure out how I'm going to be able to switch slides. That'll do. Right. So, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. Before we read the poem, there are some pre-reading questions that I would like you to consider. So, there's 4 of them. And if you don't know what the answer is, feel free to look up the answer on the internet and make a note of it in your copybook. Okay, so the first thing is, number 1, what was Ireland's political position in World War I? So World War I, also known as the Great War, was a massive international war, oddly enough, between a wide variety of countries. What was Ireland's political position officially during that World War? The second one is based on the title of this poem, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. Where is the airman from? What is fate? This concept or this idea, what is fate? And secondly, or lastly, what is an impulse? Okay, so take a few minutes to consider these before you move on to the rest of the video. So pause me for a second and have a think about those. An Irish Airman Foresees His Death by W.B. Yeats. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. No law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. To the right-hand side there, you can see vocabulary. Within the context of this poem, those that I fight makes reference to Germany and its allies. Those that I guard are the British people. Kiltartan Cross is a crossroads near Lady Gregory's home in Gort in County Galway, remembering that Lady Gregory was a great friend of Yeats and she allowed him to stay in her home, and he was very much connected with that area of Ireland. The phrase nor law nor duty means neither law nor duty. Public men are politicians, and tumult is a state of confusion or disorder. So first of all, we have some general notes on the poem. Now, the first thing to know about this poem is that it's generally accepted as being inspired by Major Robert Gregory. Major Robert Gregory was Lady Gregory's only son. He served with distinction in the Royal Flying Corps, and he was shot down and killed on a combat mission in Italy in 1918 by friendly fire. So he was shot down by an Italian plane. This was a mistake because Italy was on the same side as Major Robert Gregory. So the term used is friendly fire. He was killed by friendly fire. Major Robert Gregory was married. He had children. He was a talented artist. He was very, very wealthy. He had a good relationship with his mum. And all in all, he had a very good life. Okay, now it is important to focus on the fact here that the poem is inspired by Major Robert Gregory. However, this poem is not an elegy. So an elegy is a lament for somebody who has died, and elegies usually celebrate the dead. They show grief. They say how wonderful the person was, how amazing the person was. This poem doesn't do that. Yeats did write an elegy, which I spelled wrong. Yeats did write an elegy for Major Gregory, which was called In Memory of Major Robert Gregory. This poem is inspired by, influenced by, it is related to Major Robert Gregory, but this poem is about an Irish airman. It's not Major Robert Gregory foresees his death, it's an Irish airman foresees his death. It's not a specific individual. The speaker is anonymous, and choosing to do this gave Yeats the freedom to explore the issues and the themes that are included in this poem, or that are a part of this poem, without committing himself to the attitude that he chooses to take within this poem. And then that last general note in the poem is the speaker in this poem is an Irish national, we know that, who was chosen to fight in the British Army. Do bear in mind that although Ireland was under British rule during World War One, Irish people were not legally obliged to serve in the British Army. So, conscription, as in being forced to enlist, enlisting is signing up for the army, conscription became, I suppose, a consequence of the war in England, in Scotland, etc., but conscription was not in place in Ireland. So, Irish people were not legally obliged to serve in the British Army during World War One. Despite this, over 100,000 Irishmen joined the British forces in between 1913, 1914 and 1918. We know that the 1916 Rising and all of that civil unrest was going on at the same time, and still 100,000 Irishmen joined World War One. They joined the Allies to fight against the Axis powers, even though they were not forced to do so. Okay, so this poem is inspired by Major Robert Gregory. It is an elegy. It's not an elegy. Okay, it's not a lament, it's not an elegy. The speaker in this poem is not Major Robert Gregory. Possibly it speaks with his voice, possibly it shares some points of view that Major Robert Gregory would have had, but the poem is not titled Major Robert Gregory Foresees His Death. Okay, by choosing to have the speaker be anonymous, Yeats is able to explore some of the themes that come up in this poem, such as patriotism, nationalism, etc. And at any point, pause the video to catch up on the notes. So we have a summary of the poem. The speaker says that he shall meet his fate. Okay, he will meet his fate. He knows that this is going to happen. Your fate is your destiny, or your weird. Okay, in Scotland, I just like that word. Your destiny, your fate cannot be escaped. In theory, it is set in stone. It's something that is going to happen whether you want it to or not, which is why the speaker says that he knows he's going to meet his fate, and his fate is death. War is usually motivated by love or by hate. However, the speaker goes on to say that he does not hate the people that he fights. He does not love the people that he protects. He is Irish. He is protecting the British people. His home and the people he loves are in Kiltartan's Cross in Ireland, and it makes absolutely no difference to the people that he loves whether he wins or loses this battle. They're indifferent. Ireland is neutral in the war. Okay, the people that he loves are indifferent as to whether or not his side wins or loses, and he is not emotionally invested in this war in any way. He explains that he doesn't fight because he was required to do so by law. As an Irish person, as I mentioned, he cannot be conscripted to fight in the British Army. He didn't volunteer out of a sense of duty. He has no moral complications. He has no moral compulsion. He has no. He doesn't feel that he has to protect these people. Okay, he wasn't stirred by the politicians' speeches; those are the public men, and he wasn't stirred by the cheering crowds. Okay, so patriotism, it had no effect on him. And when we think about wartime footage, we'd often think of the politicians giving these rousing speeches to cheering crowds, trying to get people to enlist. None of that affected him. So the speaker has given us this big long list of reasons why he did not join up. Okay, so these are not the reasons that he joined up. And he continues, and he says that he chose to fight because of a lonely impulse of delight. An impulse is a strong and almost irresistible urge, and his urge to fight is because of this sense of delight. Now, as the reader of the poem, we're trying to figure out what could this be. So there are a number of ways to interpret this. Possibly delight in handling an aircraft. Okay, you can see a picture there of a fighter plane, which would have been more or less the type of plane that they would have been flying in the First World War. It was the dawn of aviation, and being able to control these fabulous machines would have been amazing. It would have been very, very exciting at the time. Possibly his delight in seeing the world from above. He has a God's eye view of the world. Not many people would have had access to that viewpoint because aviation, the ability to fly, aviation was in its infancy. Possibly the delight or the adrenaline rush that comes from flying and fighting in a war, this tumult in the crowds, this massive game of strategy in the skies when you're trying to stay alive and you're trying to beat the enemy, and the delight or the thrill of putting your life at risk. People have often reported that they never feel more alive than when they are fighting to stay alive. We value our lives most when we have to fight to preserve them. and his life would have been in balance every moment of every battle that he fought. So these are some ways of interpreting this idea of delight, and why he says, I didn't join up because I wanted to defend Britain. I didn't join up because I had to. I didn't join up because I felt like I needed to save people. I didn't join up because of this or this or this. I joined up because of a lonely impulse of delight. Okay, so those are possible interpretations of it. Now, an impulse is sometimes seen as irrational and illogical. It's linked more to feelings than to thoughts, and thinking things over deeply. But the airman stresses that he did think carefully before enlisting. He thought very calmly and very logically before he joined up, and he says that he assessed his life. Okay, and the conclusion that he came to is that all the years that he has lived so far have been a waste of breath. His future years also seem to be a waste of breath, and he decides that this life will be balanced by this death. So he's trying to seek some form of balance within the poem. This last line is enigmatic, it's puzzling, and it is ambiguous. We've come across that word a lot this year. It is ambiguous. It can be understood in more than one way. Perhaps he feels that life is meaningless and death offers an escape. Perhaps he feels that he has wasted his life and he wants to go out, I'm missing an O there, and he wants to go out in a blaze of glory. So I'm missing an O there, apologies. In a blaze of glory, okay? We're not sure. It's ambiguous. It can be interpreted in more than one way. Now, taking a look at the poetic devices that Yeats uses in this poem. So, poetic device, approach that he uses is the structure of this poem. This poem is incredible. It has 12 lines. It can be divided into quatrains, which are groups of 4 lines, but it's not laid out in stanzas. But it is really well organized and regimented. The poem consists of 2 sentences. Each sentence consists of 8 lines, and each of the sentences is divided by a semicolon or semicolons. This structure shows Yeats' technical skill as a poet. This is a very difficult poem to write. He can't get carried away by rhythm or rhyme. He has to stick very, very carefully to the structure that he has created. And what is the effect of that? Because there's no point in being able to identify a structure or a poetic device unless you can identify the effect that it has on you as a reader. So arguably, the structure of the poem echoes the rigid structure and the discipline of life in the armed forces. Okay, so the very structure, the very basic format of the poem itself is reflecting the life that the airman has chosen when he enlisted. Poetic device, rhythm. This poem has a very, very strong, a very, very definite rhythm. It's made up of 12 lines, as I mentioned, and each line has 4 stresses. This pattern is called iambic tetrameter, or possibly iambic tetrameter. What is the effect? Again, there's no point in being able to identify what the poet is doing unless you can also figure out or make an educated, relevant guess as to why the poet chooses to do this. So it's possible that Yeats chose to stick to this very definite rhythm because it reminds us of the sound of the airman's propellers rotating as he flies his plane. Okay, that very definite thump, 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 thump of the propellers as they're rotating as he's flying through the sky. Next poetic device, repetition. So the speaker repeats the word balance. Now, when the poet chooses to repeat certain words, you have to check what the effect is in each case of the words that are repeated. So he repeats the word balance, as in, I balanced all, brought all to mind, and then at the end, in balance with this life, this death. So the effect is that he's reinforcing his claim that he has made his decision logically, that it's not an impulse that he just followed blindly, that he thought about it, he reflected on it. Repeats the word, a waste of breath, which apparently autocorrect has corrected on me, so we're going to change that. It's not a water of breath, it's a waste of breath. Thank you very much, autocorrect. He repeats the words, a waste of breath, and he says, the years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath, the years behind. So, this reinforces the speaker's outlook on life. He hasn't done much, or he feels he hasn't done much with the years he has already lived. He feels he can't achieve much else with the rest of his life. Possibly a bleak outlook, possibly a depressing outlook on life, but it definitely drives the point home. he repeats the word nor. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. That nor and nor and nor, it reinforces the fact that he didn't join up for any of the normal reasons. Poetic device, anaphora, or possibly anaphora. This is a specific type of repetition. Anaphora is the repetition of words specifically at the beginning of lines. So we've got those that I. So those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. The repeated use of the pronoun those underlines the fact that he is not the same as the people he fights or the people that he guards. He is distancing himself from them. If he said, these that I fight, you would imagine him standing beside them or standing with them. But he is standing apart from them. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. Then he repeats my country. Now he repeats, my country is Kiltartan Cross. My countrymen, Kiltartan's poor. Again, underlining the fact that the speaker is not fighting for his country. So anything that is repeated, or anaphora, which is a specific type of repetition, it is underlining, it is reinforcing certain ideas that are within the poem. Next poetic device is tense, the tense that he chooses to write in. The poem is mostly written in the present tense. There is a mix, okay, of certain other tenses, but mostly it's the present tense. As in, I know, I fight, I guard, my country is. So he uses quite a lot of the present tense. And the effect of this is it makes it seem as though the airman is speaking directly to us. It makes it seem as though he is still alive and knows he is going to die. It makes the experience of reading the poem more immediate, more current, more as in right now this is happening. He knows he's going to die. He chooses to continue the fight. He refused to compromise on his dreams, on his delight. Poetic device, language. So the poem uses direct language. We know that Yeats can be a fairly flowery poet when he wants to be. He can give us poems that have impressions of colour and impressions of sounds and smells, like he did with The Lake Isle of Innisfree. He can give us poems like The Wild Swans of Cool, where we have crystal clear images of exactly what the poet wants us to see. Whereas here, the language is plain. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's direct. And again, it makes it seem as though the airman is speaking to us. Okay, it's not very, it's not really focused on kind of being very literature-like or being very fancy. It's like as though he's speaking to us. And it also leaves the poem open to the reader's imagination. Whereas in The Wild Swans of Cool, we see exactly what the poet wants us to see, interpreting it in different ways, but seeing what he wants us to see. Here, it's left open for us to interpret as we will. And remember, pause the video as you go to catch up on the notes. Themes then, we're moving on to themes. The themes within the poem. War and violence. So, at the time, World War I was the bloodiest and most destructive war that Europe had ever seen. It's called the Great War for a reason. People were absolutely taken aback at the sheer loss of life, okay, and the sheer destruction that the war caused, which is why World War I is called the Great War. It's a time of social upheaval, okay, and this social upheaval is reflected as a theme within the poem. The poem shares how an individual feels when faced with a great public event, in this case World War I. The poem was written during the war, when Ireland was divided over its attitude to this event, and the poem reflects these tensions. Okay, so the speaker says, well, I didn't join up because I had to, I wasn't conscripted. I didn't join up because I wanted to guard the people of Britain, because I'm not British. I didn't join up because I hate the Axis powers because they're not doing anything to me. My country's neutral. Okay, and those are the reasons generally that people would have joined up. So in theory, Yeats is exploring, in his own way, why so many Irishmen decided to fight for Britain, ostensibly, even though at the time Ireland was fighting and fighting and fighting for her independence from Britain. And Yeats was involved in this, very much involved in this. So again, by choosing an anonymous speaker for the poem, Yeats creates a space where he can try to figure out the motivation for joining the army, and he comes up, sorry, not the army, the Air Force, and he comes up with this delight in the clouds, or this rush of adrenaline when you're fighting for your life. Okay, So social upheaval is definitely reflected in the poem. And of course, death. The airman's death is a central theme in this poem. He sees it as inescapable and he accepts it. Okay? The Air Force pilots, as far as I can remember, in both World War I and World War II, had an incredibly high death toll within their ranks. As in, at one point in the war, I think the average lifespan of a fighter pilot was days or weeks at the time. So the airman sees his death as inescapable. He accepts it. He's calm about it. He's not raging against it. He's not fighting against it. He's not horrified by it. He knew what he was getting into. He doesn't cower from it. Instead, he plunges back into the tumult again and again and again. He has chosen this. The speaker seems almost nihilistic. Nihilism is the belief that everything in life is utterly pointless and without meaning. Okay, so this is an opinion that I came across in one of the analysis of the poem that I was reading. I'm not sure I agree with it, to be perfectly honest. I mean, he's not saying that everything is absolutely pointless. I mean, he is telling us that he joined because of this feeling of delight. But if you choose to focus on the fact that the years to come seemed a waste of breath the years behind, that nothing matters, you could argue that the speaker's point of view is nihilistic. Okay? Or perhaps you could argue that Yeats could only make sense of somebody joining up to the Great War to fight on the side of Britain if they had this nihilistic belief. You could argue that as well. Okay, so the themes that are popping up in this poem are war and violence, social upheaval, and death. Okay. A quote by Yeats himself on this poem, and he says, "It's the only thing I have written of the war or will write, so I hope it may not seem unfitting." It's the only thing I've written about the war. It's the only thing I plan to write about the war. I hope it's okay. Okay, so it's up to you if you think it is a fitting reflection of the Great War. Now, when you were studying the junior cert, you may have studied some war poetry by other poets like Siegfried Sassoon, poets like Wilfred Owen. Their poetry is much more graphic, and it shows the brutality and the bloodiness of war, and it shows what soldiers had to cope with when they were fighting. And those poems are full of anger at the government because they believed that the government was prolonging the First World War for whatever reason, and they were angry seeing what the soldiers had to suffer with shell shock, with hunger, with the horrific conditions that they faced in the trenches, coping with rats, coping with no bathrooms, coping with illness, lack of sleep, the constant fear, the constant terror. And their poems, the poems of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, they're full of anger. This poem that Yeats wrote is calm. Very, very calm. I know I'm going to die. I'm okay with that. It balances things out. Seems to be the airman's take on this. Do you think that it is a fitting way to talk about war? Do you think Yeats's poem, if it's going to talk about something like the First World War, and he's writing this at a time when the First World War is continuing and is going on, should it not be more passionate? Should Yeats not be more involved in it? Or do you think that it's a fitting poem written by a poet in a nation that is not officially involved in the war? Because Ireland was neutral. Okay, 4 questions for you to tackle. Okay, they don't have to be very, very long. A paragraph is okay, but for each one you have to support your answer with reference to the poem. Okay, so it doesn't have to be very long, but you have to support your answer with reference to the poem. That first question: what is the speaker's attitude to war? I'm not asking you what Yeats's attitude to war is. I'm not asking you what your attitude to war is. I'm asking you, what is the speaker's attitude? And the speaker in this poem is an Irish airman, anonymous. Okay, yes, Yeats put the words in his mouth, but what is the speaker's attitude to the war? You can't just decide and write it down. You have to be able to support your answer with reference to the poem. Second question: how would you describe the tone of this poem? Is it defeatist, beaten down, depressed? Is it heroic? Is it joyful? Pick one of those 3. And of course, as always, Support your answer with reference to the poem. Why did the speaker enlist? To enlist is to join up to the armed forces, be it Army, Navy, or Air Force. Why did the speaker enlist? And again, of course, support your answer with reference to the poem, because you can't just make stuff up, you have to be able to support it. And then, is this a political poem? Do you think this is a political poem? You can say yes, you can say no. You can say maybe yes, maybe no, but whatever you say, you have to support your answer with reference to the poem. And this is a very, very good time for me to remind everybody, please and thank you, to use PQE. As in, you make your point. For example, I think that this poem is heroic. You add your quote. I think it's heroic because I read this line in the poem. You stick your quote in, and then you explain that. For me, this line means that, etc., etc., etc. You have to do your PQE. Point, quote, explain. Okay, you have to back up your opinion and what you're saying with evidence from the poem. Okay, you can decide something completely off the wall if you like, so long as you can back it up and show that you have read and that you have understood the poem. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Get the questions done. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.